Yo, what's up, fellas? I've got on. I do not know how to pronounce your name. I'm so sorry. Uh,
I'll
uh,
it.
yeah, yeah. Please,
My name is Cristina Arroyo.
Christina Arroyo. Did I say it?
Arroyo.
Arroyo. Okay, okay. And I got her on to talk about Puerto Rican history. She's a great content creator on TikTok. She makes a lot of TikToks on Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican history, just a lot of stuff like that. And yeah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. Actually, my full name is Cristina Arroyo Rodriguez because we use both of our parents' last names. Um, and I moved to the United States to go to college. So I moved to Boston, and currently I'm living in New York. I just finished writing a book on Puerto Rican colonialism and how it's manifested today, not only in Puerto Rico, but in the United States. So the whole idea is that when we think about colonialism or oppression and things like that, we think about it like back in the day when the United States colonized the Native Americans, or when Christopher Columbus came over, or Jim Crow South. However, all that stuff is literally happening today. So
Yeah.
that's basically what I'm working on right now.
That's absolutely wonderful. But just beginning off, first of all, like for international viewers or people who aren't familiar with Puerto Rico, what is Puerto Rico? Like, could you give us like a brief, just even geographical location of Puerto Rico, and just a brief history of Puerto Rico before it became part of America?
Yeah.
I know I know that's a lot to ask.
Oh yeah, you're just like, hey, just tell us like 600 years of history. That's not this. Puerto Rico is an island that's 100 miles by 30 miles, so it's relatively small. Actually, it's an archipelago because it has several islands around it, tinier ones that are part of Puerto Rico. We're right in the middle of the Caribbean. So the Caribbean has islands amongst it, and it has a group of islands that's called the Greater Antilles, which includes Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. And Puerto Rico is the smallest island of the Greater Antilles, and next to us are the smaller islands that are the Lesser Antilles, like the U.S. Virgin Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Dominique, Trinidad and Tobago, stuff like that.
Okay.
Puerto Rico, just like a lot of the islands in the Caribbean, was originally inhabited by native islanders in Puerto Rico and several other islands. They were called the Taínos. Christopher Columbus came over in 1492, and that's when we were first invaded and colonized. Spain colonized us from 1492 till 1898 when the United States invaded, and Spain just ceded us over to the United States after the Spanish-American War. The United States paid $20 million in gold bars. It was actually an IOU because they didn't want to move the gold bars to Spain. And they bought with it the Philippines. But Puerto Rico was for free.
Oh my gosh. Oh
Yeah,
my gosh.
so we've been a colony of the United States in practice since 1898 till today.
So America got like a buy two get one free sort of with like Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, they got the Philippines, they got Guam, and they got Puerto Rico. Originally, they had their eyes on the Caribbean because the Spanish Empire was sort of like weakening, and the United States wanted to have military posts in the Caribbean.
Yeah. Yeah. And,
Cuba, as a matter of fact. So
and they sort of semi got Cuba. Like they wrote the Cuban Constitution. It was
yeah.
unofficial. Yeah. Yeah. But what was Spanish rule really like? Like early period, sort of like a little bit later on. Like how oppressive was it? Was because within American mythology, it's really that America saved Puerto Rico from Spanish colonialism. So,
So that's a funny story. I mean, the Spanish were genocidal. And
Yeah.
they were literally genocidal. Isn't it Columbus Day next Monday?
It's Columbus Day next week, I
Yes.
believe. Yes.
Yeah. So Columbus literally came in and his people came in. And they didn't technically enslave the native islanders because they didn't have such a thing back then. But they did it in practice. They killed a lot of them, killed them with disease as well. They engaged in the transatlantic slave trade. So it was pretty barbaric initially. Throughout the centuries, Spain just took over Puerto Rico basically for farmland, for farming. And what happened was that we became a mixture of people. We became a mixture of Caucasian people from Spain, which were the landlords and the farm heads and the kings of businesses. Then, since they killed almost all of them, they had to bring in more labor, which is when they used African slave labor. So they brought Africans to Puerto Rico. And then some of the Taínos were there. Everybody got with each other. Sometimes, forced, coerced.
Right.
And then there came to be the Jíbaro, which is the Puerto Rican that is part Spanish, part African, part Taíno. And those were the people who usually worked the lands.
Okay.
And there's a funny story to that because what would happen is they would exploit us, obviously, the Spanish, right? And the Spanish started complaining to the Spanish crown in the 18th century and the 17th century because they said they also wanted to instill Catholicism really hardcore. But what was happening is that they complained to the crown and they said, hey, you have to bring the Spanish police here because these Puerto Ricans are crazy. They're going crazy. And the Spanish crown is like, are they going crazy like in the other islands where they're literally killing all the Spanish people? And they're like, no, here's what they're doing. They're working full time, obviously. But then in their spare time, they're drinking, they're going to whorehouses, and they're just engaging in general debauchery, which is very anti-Catholic.
Right.
So they were very angry that we were partying so much. The Spanish crown was like, I'm not sending police for that. It's ridiculous. So that's a funny part. Well, not that funny because there was exploitation, but it's
Right.
I was like, see, I inherited that legacy of my family partying for no reason. Let's just party. Let's go.
Absolutely. And what was, I'm sorry to cut you off, but what was the sort of racial caste system like? I know in Mexico, there was sort of like a 3-tiered based on how, much original Spanish blood you have, how much you're mixed with indigenous. Was there something similar like that in Puerto Rico?
There was, but it wasn't like official and it
Okay.
wasn't set in stone. It was more of a commercial, like a sort of like, it depended on, the caste system wasn't really that racial since we were so mixed and there were so many different colors around. It was more about who owned the land.
Okay.
It was mostly white Spanish people. Yeah.
Okay.
Through time, though, Puerto Ricans revolted against the Spanish, engaged in armed resistance, and and 3 months before the U.S. invaded, Spain actually added us as one of its provinces. So we would have a seat in the Spanish court, and we had all the same rights as every other Spanish province for 3 months. And then the Americans invaded. And here's the thing. I don't think a lot of people understand this, which is like, at least in Puerto Rico, when there was a revolution, and just like in a lot of places in the world, it wasn't like everybody was revolting. Most people were just working too hard and just weren't even bothered. They're like, I just want to survive.
Mhm.
So it was like only a few people that were revolting. So the U.S. came over and said to the Puerto Ricans, listen, let us like help you drive off the Spanish, right? And then you'll have a great relationship with the United States and we'll let you be free. That didn't happen.
Right.
So you had two types of groups going against the U.S. when this was happening. It was the groups that didn't trust the U.S. and said, hell no, we know what you're doing. You're also an empire, And there was the groups of rich farm owners and landowners that got rich because of Spain and didn't want to lose that when the U.S. would come in.
Right.
So it was like two opposite groups that were against the U.S. The U.S. came, invaded, engaged, and applied military rule in Puerto Rico, and then started appointing governors since, I believe, 1901. And since then, they've changed our economy in order to benefit the United States and leave us in poverty.
Okay. So we've sort of got a general background. What is Puerto Rico now like? Legally, what is it considered? It's obviously not a state. There's always talk about statehood, and like, what rights do Puerto Ricans have, and what don't they have, like compared to an average American citizen?
Puerto Rico is, with the Treaty of Paris in 1898, they called us a possession. That's the technical term. Okay. In 1952, that's when we first established the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, which in Spanish is translated to the Free Associated State. By the way, those two words are not the same when you directly translate them. I don't know what's happening.
Yeah, I don't know where the balloons came from.
I'm like, that's not a good thing, you guys. Let's not celebrate. A Commonwealth is not translated as a free associated state. It was a way we told Puerto Ricans we were a free associated state. By the way, we weren't free, we weren't associated,
Right.
and we were not a state. And to the U.S., we called it a Commonwealth. And, this was done with Congress as well, U.S. Congress, because the U.S. wanted to show the world that it no longer had possessions or colonies. So this was in 1952. Because they didn't want to they were criticizing Russia and the Soviet Union, right? For engaging in colonialism. So they didn't want to seem to the world that they still had colonies. So they changed the name in practice. However, it's interesting because that didn't matter. Because even in that paperwork and those laws, they say that we don't have a compact with Puerto Rico. They don't say we have a compact or an agreement, right? A mutually binding agreement. They have the nature of a compact, which means it's like, in nature, perhaps.
Theoretically.
That.
Right.
Theoretically, but it's not binding. And basically, the contract is that the United States can do whatever they want to Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico doesn't even have to agree to it or even suggest anything.
Oh, my God.
So what happens with that is that Puerto Ricans in the island do not have the right to vote in any federal elections. So we don't have the right to vote for President of the United States. We have no voting representative in Congress or the House of Representatives, in Senate or the House of Representatives. And yet we have to follow all federal law and federal rules. Okay? So some of the things that Puerto Ricans, for example, as recent as 2022, right? The Supreme Court ruled that Puerto Ricans who are in the island don't need to be paid social disability benefits. Yes, because since we don't pay into all the federal taxes, then we don't have the right to all the federal monies. That's what they said, even though we're U.S. citizens since 1917. And along with that, we have a lot of rights and a lot of the benefits and rights that the United States people who live in the United States have. We don't get them just because we live on the island. And by the way, they're basing all of these decisions, the Supreme Court and even lesser courts are basing all of these decisions on insular cases, which were cases that happened in the early 1900s in which they would call Puerto Ricans uncivilized savages and alien races.
Right.
And they still use them to uphold their decisions today.
Right. Why do you think America needs Puerto Rico so badly? Is it resources there? Is it for military reasons? Why does the American empire seem to need to have such a grip on Puerto Rico? Perhaps even easily exploitable labor force?
Well, here's the thing. It has changed through time.
Yeah.
However, it has always, initially, it was established for military purposes. And we did have the U.S. Navy in Puerto Rico till 2003. Okay? They were testing weapons in the island of Vieques, which is one of the tiny islands off of Puerto Rico, which is part of Puerto Rico. The people in Vieques since 1942, I believe, they've been doing testing war games, etc. in the island. Other places in Puerto Rico también also. And the people on that island have been experiencing just record levels of cancer for decades. And we have protests at the Navy there, to the point that in 2001, finally, they said, fine, we'll shut down the testings here. And it took them till 2003. Still, they haven't cleaned up any of the area. So a lot of the water and the nature is polluted, and people still are dying of cancer. But but as soon as they came into Puerto Rico, the United States, even the first governor appointed, his name was Charles Herbert Allen, they noticed that it was good for commercial farmland. So what the United States has done throughout over a century is changed our economy at their whim, regardless of how we're doing. So they devalued our money initially, 100% mostly. And what they did was, we had multi-crop systems, which worked well, because then people would be working all the time and have a lot of resources and food to, to be able to sustain themselves. They made it all sugar, which is a monocrop system. It's only a certain times of years that you could do that. And then when the sugar thing wasn't working anymore, they started industrializing us in the 50s. And then came the pharmaceuticals. And then they stopped that in the mid-2000s. And since then, we've been bankrupt. So.
Oh, my gosh. So with Puerto Rico, what is Puerto Rico used as nowadays? Is it just like an easily exploitable labor force? Is it just, obviously the military's not there. Is it just like an empire that's so stubborn that it refuses to, sort of lose its grip over Puerto Rico? What would you say Puerto Rico is mostly used by the American empire for in the modern day?
Well, right now, since the late 2000s till today, I would say it's being used as a tax haven for wealthy Americans to come in and engage in commercial colonialism. So what the laws that we have now is that an American person can come in and that they buy a business or they buy a complex, like an apartment complex to rent and things like that. If it costs us more than a certain amount of money, they pay zero taxes on it. Puerto Ricans still have to pay taxes on their own homes and everything, but these leaders of commerce that are Americans don't. So you have the crypto billionaires and millionaires coming into Puerto Rico and starting businesses there, and they literally say this is a tax haven for us.
Oh my!
So a lot of Puerto Ricans are being displaced right now. It doesn't help also that in 2016, the Obama-Biden administration passed the most colonial and damaging law since 1952, since we became a Commonwealth. And that's the Promesa Bill, which made it, since we were bankrupt, they said, you guys are no longer allowed to decide what you do in the island with your money. So any insular economic decisions, which we used to have, right, since the 1950s, now we don't have them. And instead, Congress, U.S. Congress, who we didn't vote for, appointed people from the United States to make decisions as to how to spend and budget our money.
It's almost like such a very blatant like double standard where Puerto Ricans are almost like second-class citizens. It's insane how blatant it is, right? They don't even try to hide it, that you guys don't have a democracy, that you guys are basically a colonial possession. Of course they remove the word colonial, but it's very in your face. I think that is one of the most annoying things about what you could call sort of Western ideology, is that it's this very bad analysis of the world. Like Puerto Ricans don't deserve to like rule themselves even, but it's like enforced by force. So like it's this awful analysis of the world that Puerto Ricans don't even deserve to decide where their money goes, but it's backed by force, where it's like enforced onto other people against their own. What would you say are the biggest issues just facing, what have the effects been on just modern day Puerto Ricans, or even just Puerto Rican people throughout history of like Spanish colonialism, post-Spanish colonialism, and then American colonialism? Obviously, there was genocide with the Taínos, and slavery, but like how has America just affected the average Puerto Rican?
Well, historically, the worst way that America has affected Puerto Ricans is that they have displaced us. They have made it so possible to live economically in the island that we've had to move outside of the island to the United States. So there are more Puerto Ricans living in the diaspora than there are Puerto Ricans in the island.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Puerto Rico, if it were made a state, it would be the poorest state by far, by 3 times as much as Mississippi. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Over half of our people are under the poverty line. Okay? There's been mass brain drain also of professionals in Puerto Rico and since the 2000s, especially due to the bankruptcy and because of Hurricane Maria. Okay? So what's happening, it's interesting because you say like, oh, it's so obvious that it's a colony, but the thing is that we're so invisible, and that's the problem. Nobody talks about us. Like, usually the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, it doesn't matter to us. Every single president and every single administration has been devastating to Puerto Ricans in different ways, right? So the interesting thing is, and I'm going to draw some parallels here, is that I read an article by an Israeli, really well-renowned journalist recently, talking about that the United States, in history, they have criticized Israel because they say, well, Palestine is a colony of Israel. How can you have a colony, blah, blah, blah. And then this Israeli journalist was like, well, you're criticizing us for having a colony, but Puerto Rico is a colony of the U.S. And then there was a response by an almost like Pulitzer Prize winning journalist from the Atlantic in the U.S. saying like, well, Puerto Rico is not technically a colony because they have referendums in which they decide how they want to be affiliated with us.
It's not a colony by technicality, like the most basic technicality.
But we've had 6 referendums since 1968. Each referendum defines statehood, commonwealth, or free associated state. They change the words, or independence very differently. They're all different formats, and a lot of them have been boycotted. But the most important part about these referendums is that they're non-binding. So the U.S. has ignored every single one, and they say the reasons they agree with them or not, but ultimately they don't have to do anything. They're non-binding. Referendum is happening actually in November.
So Puerto Ricans can't even decide what happens in their own country. Anytime they do pass something, it's just ignored by the United States. It's not obligated to pass anything. And then Puerto Ricans have pretty much been economically displaced from their own lands, essentially strangers in their own lands. Is there a good amount of gentrification and things like that, like we see in, for example, Hawaii, where a lot of vacationers push out native peoples, or is it just tax haven stuff?
It's mostly tax haven stuff, but they have been pushing out a lot of people from their homes. And the beaches in Puerto Rico are public, but a lot of times they create hotels and Airbnbs. So they're pushing people out, and then they pretend the beach is private and they don't allow Puerto Ricans in it. So we've been like protesting that even recently, even like yesterday. People have been protesting developments in Puerto Rico. I wouldn't say it's gentrification, like where my whole family still lives, and I go there twice a year. There's a very beautiful beach nearby, and it has become a American town, basically. My mom even told me they have, she told me last year, now they have a grocery store just for like Americans with their American foods.
Right.
She told me. So it's not really gentrification. It's literally colonial displacement.
Colonial displacement, right? And
yes.
And two people, there's two completely different like worlds, like the Puerto Rican world and the American world. Right.
Yes.
Right. And this is obviously the thesis of your book, so maybe you can go a little bit into that basic thesis. Would you consider Puerto Rico colonized? I know obviously you began this by saying it is, so maybe you could go into a little bit of the thesis of your book and what it's about and things like that.
Yes, Puerto Rico is still a colony. Just like they can call it a territory, they can call it a commonwealth, they can call it a free associated state. Some people have proposed an enhanced commonwealth. These are all terms that fall under the umbrella of, in practice, this is a colony. because Puerto Ricans have no voice and no vote. We have a commissioner in Washington that we elect every year. They go there, they have no vote in whatever happens to Puerto Rico. They just go there to talk to U.S. Congress people. In terms of how we're still colonized, I explained so many ways that we still are. But I mean, like, a lot of my book also draws parallels to other resistance movements and other oppressed people.
Yeah.
And if you look around the world, whether it's in Palestine, Ireland back in the day, and in Puerto Rico today, colonizers mostly do the same stuff.
Yeah.
Yes. So Puerto Rico, when it first started, they sent Puerto Ricans from Puerto Rico to the United States in 1901 to colonial schools with Native Americans to citizenize them. That's what they called it. They experimented drugs like the birth control pill. They experimented with that with Puerto Rican women to the point that in the 70s, 1 in 3 Puerto Rican women had been completely sterilized, coerced and forced.
Could you go a little bit more into that program? How was it done? Was it like discreetly through doctors? How exactly did they administer that?
They created ethics boards.
Okay.
In Puerto Rico. And they didn't say like, oh, this is a sterilization experiment. This is the birth control pill experiment. They sold it as women have a choice now.
Yeah.
But really, the reason the medical boards in the U.S. and the people in the U.S. did this, and they wrote about it, and they said it to you to your face. They wrote about this all the time, is we're dealing with overpopulation in Puerto Rico. It was a lie. That was a lie. So we want to address it so that we can help the poor people of Puerto Rico not fall into greater economic despair. So what they would do to women is they would tell them, listen, this pill, it'll help you not have kids until you want to, except it had crazy amounts they were testing the amount of medicine and chemicals in the pill to see what would be safe and unsafe. Some women were coerced and forced into it. They would be told, listen, some women who were already pregnant would come to the hospital and they would say, we're not going to admit you or help you give birth unless you sign that you will get sterilized after you give birth to this child. Women who wanted to get jobs, some factories would tell them, we cannot give you a job unless we know you're sterilized. So that's how they did it for a long time.
So essentially, it was like the Puerto Rican people were both used as guinea pigs, and also it was just like a eugenics program. I guess like you could sort of say like inferior peoples that they consider. It's crazy that it happened within like most people's lifetimes, though. Like the 70s, we often think about like these evil things happening in like the 10s, the 40s, the 1800s, but it's within recent memory. There's so many of our parents, people alive, just remember that. And it was 1 in 3 women, you said. That's an insane amount.
By the 1970s, it was 1 in 3 women who were of birth-giving age that had been sterilized.
How do modern day Puerto Rican people feel about sort of the U.S. empire, their place within the U.S. empire? What would you say is the general feeling within both the diaspora and people on the island?
It's tough. It's a tough thing. And the idea of decolonizing Puerto Rico has different meanings to different people, not only in Puerto Rico, but also around the world, especially in the United Nations. In Puerto Rico, when you speak of decolonization, it means one of two things. It means becoming completely a state, right? Or it means becoming completely independent. Okay? And the United Nations, since the 60s, they've been talking about trying to push the United States to decolonize Puerto Rico in the Decolonization Committee, which initially the United States was in it, but then decided to quit it after a few years because they said that these third world countries were bullying them. So they're like, we're not going to be in this committee anymore. So they never listened to us. But think about this, right? Puerto Ricans have rebelled in their own ways. A lot of times the ways we have rebelled historically and even till today is through our Spanish language. We have tried to keep us speaking Spanish and not give that away or forget it, okay? However, right, there's been a project of American colonialism since 1898 in Puerto Rico, moving Puerto Ricans around, displacing Puerto Ricans, all that stuff. So there's no general consensus in Puerto Rico. The consensus that what Puerto Ricans believe is three different things, which are three statuses options. Some Puerto Ricans want statehood because they believe, here's a question they pose: how can we survive without the United States?
Right.
Those are the people who want statehood because they do believe that it would be worse without the United States. And recently, especially, but throughout history, this has happened. It has come to the idea of like, if we are not a state and we become independent, then we're going to end up like those communists in Venezuela or Cuba.
Right, right.
Or those communists. And that's the talk right now. During the elections are coming up for governor. And that's the talk right now. That's what's happening. So yeah. So that's the idea that like Puerto Ricans don't believe we can survive without the United States, and they're afraid of becoming the next Cuba or the next Venezuela.
Yes.
Which are the narratives, and that's the propaganda. The pro-independence people are saying, their question is, how can we survive with the United States? Look at us now. There hasn't been progress in Puerto Rico. And that's what they push for. And then there's the middle ground people who want to stay as they are. The biggest two parties are the middle ground people, who are the pro-Commonwealth people, and the pro-statehood people. Those are the biggest parties. However, and this is very interesting, what's happening right now with the gubernatorial elections in Puerto Rico is that the pro-independence candidate is actually beating the pro-Commonwealth candidate by 10 points.
Oh my gosh.
Which that has never happened. Historically, since we've been able to vote, right? On average, the pro-independence candidate gets about 1 to 2% of the votes. And there's reasons for this, which I'm going to go into a little bit later. But right now, he's getting 25% of the votes. And that's a third party. The pro-independence is a third party.
And would you say this is sort of reflective of just like the overall decline of the American empire in general? Like America slowly is losing its grip over the world. It's sort of in a state of decline. Do you think that this has sort of been created by that opportunity in Puerto Rico?
See, here's the thing about Puerto Ricans in the islands.
Yeah.
They aren't super in tune with what's happening in the United States.
Got it.
They're in tune with what's happening in the island. So what they see from the United States is how the United States treats them. So in terms of like the declining empire, I don't think a lot of them know or even care.
Right. Because it's the same treatment no matter what.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think the reason for this is the pro-independence party was strong in the 40s and early 50s. But what happened during that time? What happened during that time is that the United States allowed Puerto Ricans to vote for their own governor because of international pressures and to decide to be a commonwealth instead of a colony, right?
Mm-hmm.
So while they were doing that, they were suppressing and oppressing the pro-independence parties at the same time. From about 1946 to 1957, there was a law in Puerto Rico called the gag law, which meant that if you even spoke about independence, if you waved a Puerto Rican flag, if you sang the Borinqueña, which is the Puerto Rican national anthem, you would be thrown in prison. If you visited the grave of a pro-independence person that died in the 30s and left flowers, they would arrest you. So that's how bad it was back then. So the pro-independence party was annihilated by the end of the 50s. And there have been, resistance, armed resistance as well, not only in Puerto Rico, but a lot of the armed resistance has been in the diaspora, in New York mostly. And they've been, they went hardcore. Right. In the 50s, they shut up Congress. They were arrested, obviously.
Could you elaborate on that? I've never heard of that. In the 50s,
A lot of
Puerto
people
Ricans.
haven't.
Yeah.
Yes, a lot of people haven't. So they were, they were armed resistance. It was a group of 3 people. And the main person in the group, her name, Lolita Lebron. And they went into Congress one day in the U.S. and brought in guns and shot into the ceiling, unfurled the Puerto Rican flag, and said, free Puerto Rico. Long live free Puerto Rico.
Right.
Accidentally, the bullets ricocheted off the ceiling and hit 6 U.S. congressmen.
Oh, my
Nobody
God.
died. Yeah, I know. And when they arrested her, by the way, she was dressed to the nines. She looked beautiful. She was wearing heels, a dress, a gorgeous woman.
Oh, my God.
Right.
She wanted to make a statement.
By the way, back in the day, the armed resistance people, they dressed up.
They always do.
They
They
did.
always do. Yeah.
I love that. It's such great fashion. And when they told her, why did you do this? You almost killed people. She said, I didn't come here to kill anyone. I came here to die for my country. She was in prison for a long time. She was pardoned in the 70s because of international pressure. And she actually, one of the strategies she used is that she called her lawyer and she said, hey, I want the UN and in the international community to see us as freedom fighters and not as terrorists, as the US are seeing us and labeling us. And she said, I want to do it legally like the Palestinians have done it in international court. I want to be construed as a freedom fighter like the Palestinians, and she wrote Free Palestine. And this was in the 70s. So
What a badass. She shot up Congress and she got freed by international pressure. She relabeled herself successfully from terrorist to freedom fighter, as she should have. Oh my God. What was her name again?
Lolita Lebron.
Lolita Lebron. Oh my God.
Yeah.
What an absolute badass.
Yes, and then in 2001, she was protesting in Vieques against the U.S. Navy, and she was arrested for protesting.
Absolutely amazing.
As an old lady.
Absolutely amazing person. Oh my God. And then are there any other notable Puerto Rican armed uprisings on the island and in the diaspora?
The biggest one in the island was in there was one in the 30s, which ended up being a massacre. That's what happened. But it wasn't really an uprising. It was just that they wanted to, like the nationalists, which were the pro-independence people, wanted to march in a Sunday, like a Palm Sunday parade. And then the U.S. Insular Police just killed 22 people, including children.
Oh my God.
Just killed a lot of people. But the biggest uprising in Puerto Rico has been for U.S. rule has been in October 30th, 1950. And the leader of that movement, they were nationalists. And the leader of that movement was Pedro Albizu Campos. Basically what they did was that they took over several police stations around the island. And that's how they were trying to... They weren't trying to take over the island. They knew that wasn't going to happen.
Right.
What they were trying to do is garner international attention. That's what they were trying to do. And that was the biggest one. The U.S. bombed 2 towns in our island. They brought in the military. It was insane. They didn't kill Pedro Albizu Campos because they didn't want to make him a martyr. They put him in prison and they did radiation. They experimented with radiation poisoning with him. And he died of that.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So once again, a Puerto Rican person used as a guinea pig of the U.S. empire. That's crazy. So why do you think Puerto Rican history? Oh wait, hold on. I've got another one. What you mentioned the parties in Puerto Rico, the Independence Party. What does the modern day Puerto Rican political landscape look like? What are the major parties? What do they stand for? Is it similar to like the Democrat Republican binary we have in America, or is it different?
No, it's very different.
Okay.
And people don't understand that a lot in the U.S. because it's all about our status, you know? And I feel a lot more in the US, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, especially in modern times, is about engaging in human and civil rights, right? And our parties are about our colonial status. So it's not really about that. We have three parties. We have two major parties, which is the Pro-Commonwealth Party, which is the original party that we established in 1952. And they have been one of the strongest parties in the island since then. We have the pro-statehood party, which is also very strong. The last 2 or 3 governors we've had have been pro-statehood. And then there's the third parties. The pro-independence party has always been a third party. We also have another third party, which is a religious party, which is like kind of like a very Catholic party. You know, and they're more concerned about like abortion, you know, teaching religion in schools.
Okay, so like social issues of Puerto Rico. Yeah.
Yes. And that's the parties that there are right now. Like I said, the pro-independence party this is historic, whether they win or not, garnering 25% in the polls. That's never happened since ever.
Okay.
In Puerto Rico, especially beating the original party of the Puerto Rican Commonwealth, which is what we have. But let me make a very important distinction here.
Yeah.
Even though the parties have always led by, this is what we believe the status should be, in these elections, they have strayed away from that. The pro-independence party has said, these elections aren't about status. It's about who's going to be the best manager for Puerto Rico. So them garnering more, you know, more attention and more support is not really garnering support for independence. I think it's a reaction to insular corruption that has been happening for decades in Puerto Rico.
So people are just sort of fed up with the traditional parties, and so they're going towards the independent party just for just to get out of like what's been served so far. Do you think that if the Independence Party won, anything major would actually change, or is it again like sort of like a non-binding? Because you guys have already had a couple statehood governors, and nothing's really changed since then. So, do you think it would actually represent a major shift, like politically, or would it just be sort of more like moral, intellectually?
It would not mean any systemic changes at all.
Okay.
It would be a symbolic change,
right?
That for sure, right? But let me tell you something about the pro-independence party. The pro-independence party are not nationalists. They're not armed resistance. Actually, it all started from a big nationalist party back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right? But they splintered off because they actually didn't want to engage in armed resistance. And they believed that we could diplomatically, within the systems already in place, within the diplomatic and legal systems established by the United States, we can negotiate independence with the United States. That's what they believed. So they were very conservative in terms of liberation.
Right.
And yet, when you mention pro-independence in Puerto Rico, people think that's like, oh my God, that's the most extreme thing I've ever heard.
The most radical thing ever, yeah.
They weren't even radical. They were never radical. They were the most conservative, like, arm of the nationalist group. And they splintered off because they didn't like the nationalists. And the nationalists weren't even socialists or communists. They had some socialists and communists in there, and they didn't even want the socialists and communists in there. So we're very far away from what people consider very extreme, the whole idea of, like, you're communist. It's like, not even the nationalists that engaged in bombing things were communists or socialists.
Right, right.
Now, the random groups, right, the splinter groups, and after all this happened in the 60s and 70s, right, and some in the 80s, that weren't connected to the Independence Party, they were just splintered off, right, armed resistance, a lot of them were Marxist-Leninists.
Okay.
Yes.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. And one of those groups bombed 80 places in the United States, 80 businesses and government buildings that they thought were accelerating the U.S. imperialism in the island.
How is this not what more well known? Like, I feel like Puerto Rican activists shot up Congress. They bombed 80 businesses and places in America, and it's not even mentioned in any American history books. I have a history degree. It was never mentioned to me once in any of my classes, and I've even taken classes on Latin America several times. That's insane.
I haven't even told you about the Puerto Ricans in the 1950, after the thing happened on the island, after the revolution happened on the island, 2 days after, 2 Puerto Ricans went to assassinate Truman and almost killed him and killed 2 of his Secret Service in the Blair House.
Oh my gosh.
Truman in his underwear. Yep. But that leads to the answer of the question that you're asking me. It's like, how do we not know about this? When that happened to Truman, somebody asked him in Congress about it, some reporter or something, and he didn't say more than 2 sentences about it. He's like, oh yeah, they were crazy, whatever.
Yeah.
That's it. The revolution happened in Puerto Rico. It wasn't a revolution. It was almost not mentioned in U.S. newspapers, and they just called these people insane. They're saying, I don't know why they're doing this. They're just crazy. The word terrorist was used later on, but in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, it was mostly, they're insane. So it's not published in U.S. newspapers. And it's interesting because that's what I sort of wanted to do in my book. And it was kind of tough for me to research a lot of my book because I couldn't find things in already published books or essays or anything like that. I had to go to primary sources because nobody had written about it.
Right.
And the thing is that I looked up. I was like, okay, I want to know when the massacre happened in Ponce in 1930, which was a big massacre, right? It was talked about in some U.S. newspapers like a blurb. And it was like, these crazy guys started shooting at the police, and then the police had to shoot back. That's not what happened. Nobody shot at the police.
Right.
That didn't happen at all. So that's the sort of thing that would happen, or it wouldn't even get mentioned. So people say, history is written by the winners, by the victors. And I actually, I want to expand on that in my book. And I'm like, yeah, sort of is written sort of by the winners, but let's talk about it and let's really talk about it. History is not just written by the winners. This is not a game. This is people's real lives. History is written by the people who killed the other people, and now those other people can't write their history. History is written by those who are still alive. That's it. So a lot of the pro-independence, armed resistance people, they're either been incarcerated, censored, killed by the FBI. So it's very hard to learn the history because you have to go to the original newspapers. I've read thousands of pages of U.S. Congress, just meetings and sessions. And the way U.S. Congress talked about Puerto Ricans in 1901 is the same way U.S. Congress talks about Puerto Ricans in 2022.
Maybe some racial slurs or something like that is removed, but it's basically the same messaging overall. It's PC racism, you could sort of say.
Oh, don't even think it's that PC.
Really?
It's not that PC either.
Okay.
And it's very interesting. So how do we not know about this? When I started writing this book, I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. I went to elementary school and high school in Puerto Rico.
Yes.
I come from a family that is highly educated. My mom is a school teacher. My dad was a district court judge, and he's a lawyer now. So they were always involved in politics. So I was always around this. And the more I started researching this past year, I remember finding out things. And I'm like, how come I didn't know about this? And I called my mom one day, and she's still in Puerto Rico. And I'm just like, Mom, I was like, I went to school in Puerto Rico, in a Puerto Rican school, right? All my life. I was like, how come I didn't know about all this stuff? And she just says with one sentence, she just laughs. And she just says with one sentence, she's like, oh, the schools are Americanized.
Right.
That's it. They're Americanized.
Right. They're mostly just trying to teach you to be good colonial subjects. They're not going to teach you like the tools to liberate yourself or knowledge that's actually going to liberate yourself. Well, why do you think Puerto Rican history is ignored by American like historical institutions, like the historiography field in America? Like, is there like a colonial sort of supremacy in American historiography, or why do like American universities and institutions, professors, things like that ignore it so much, do you think?
I think, like I said, we've always been so invisible, right? But it's interesting that you asked me that, because there's been recently there's been a resurgence in writing about Puerto Rican liberationist history by Puerter Ricans, but also by Puerto Ricans in the diaspora. And there was a book that's called Puerto Rico: A National History that just came out earlier this year, I believe, written by a Puerto Rican in the diaspora. And I have to just laugh about this. This is why. There was a review written by, I think it was the Wall Street Journal. In the Wall Street Journal, by an American academic, criticizing the book. This American academic also happened to be a member of the financial management board that the U.S. appointed to manage our finances and pay back all the Wall Street investors that we owed. Okay?
Right.
And this American man who makes decisions for Puerto Ricans without being elected, and who's never lived, is not Puerto Rican at all, hasn't suffered from Puerto Rican history or discrimination or colonialism, writes a review of this book saying that this author is going too far in his pro-independence stances, which, by the way, he wasn't. He was really centrist about it. And then he said, all those things that he's so proud about Puerto Rico, he has to thank the United States for those things.
Oh my God. What absolute bullshit.
Insane. And I'm like, this was published literally 2 months ago or something. It was recently published.
You were not kidding when you said that they're not even that PC these days.
They're not.
They're very open. Yeah. So it almost seems like the whole superstructure is like revolving around just suppressing Puerto Rico as much as possible. The media doesn't want to mention it. Congress doesn't want to mention it. Even historians don't want to mention it. And if you do mention it, and if you do mention something that says that Puerto Rico is a victim of American colonialism, or Puerto Rico needs independence, or even a moderate stance like that historian took, they're offended by it. They're offended that you dare challenge this hegemony. I've worked with not worked, but I've met a lot of historians and professors in American universities, and they obviously do have such a very pro-American sort of white chauvinist bias. How do you explain, and you sort of went into that, your answer with that answer that your mom gave you, but how do you explain Puerto Ricans that think that Puerto Rico needs America, right? Like the ones that feel like Puerto Rico has to be part of America, or can only be successful with America?
I think that's all we collectively remember, because there's been a lot of cultural erasure that happened because of U.S. colonialism. Our collective memory is not that good. Also, there's been a lot of propaganda.
Yeah.
There's been also, there's internalized colonialism and internalized oppression. So Puerto Ricans, and I think this is the case in a lot of Latin America and across the world, there's a lot of colorism. My grandmother herself would write that she was Caucasian in the census forever, and she was not. Like, she would say, I'm white. She would tell me, Christina, do you have a boyfriend? And I would always, like, even though I didn't, I would joke around with her when I was in high school or early college. I would joke around, yeah, he's Jamaican. He's very black. And she's like, no, don't say that. You have to improve the race.
Right.
So a lot of Puerto Ricans look up at America. They have bought the American dream. They have bought the whole idea of it. I mean, half of my family is pro-Trump.
Right.
Yeah.
So it does it begin in education? Is it media? Like, is it everything combined?
Everything combined. Everything combined. Yes. And the United States has tried to erase our history throughout all of it.
Okay. And so, I mean, obviously know what you're gonna say to this, but should Puerto Rico be independent? And if so, like why? Like, why should Puerto Rico be independent?
I do think it should be independent.
Yes.
Obviously, there's the mechanisms of how do we become independent, right? And that's a whole other question. But here's the thing. Every single person in the world, and every community in the world, every culture, they deserve self-determination. That's what I believe. When we talk, I have talked so long, and this pisses me off so much, it makes me want to cry. I've talked to so many Americans right here. And I'm like, yeah, we deserve self-determination, obviously, right? We deserve to vote for the people we want to have and to make our own decisions about what's good for us. And they say, well, but we don't think you're ready for it.
Right.
I was like, but here's the thing. That's none of your fucking business. Sorry, I just cursed.
No, it's
here's the
okay.
thing about that.
You can curse all you want.
Oh, okay. Like, here's the thing about that. It's none of your business. Because you're not Puerto Rican. You're the colonizers. Why do you have to set criteria for our self-determination and for our freedom, right? Criteria that you don't even meet. That the United States doesn't even meet. They're saying, well, Puerto Ricans aren't doing this, so they don't deserve to be free. In 1908, one of the Puerto Rican politicians wrote a letter to the U.S. saying to them, we deserve self-determination. And he said, listen, you tell us that we're a backwards race, right? That we're savages, that we're uncivilized. But it is in your country that you have segregation between blacks and whites. We don't have that here. It is in your country that you have all these oppressive laws. We don't have that here. We don't do that. So perhaps you shouldn't impose this criteria on us. But also, on top of that, what makes you qualified to be our colonizers if you can't even manage your own country?
Absolutely.
So it's tough because people bring up, oh, well, Puerto Ricans decide with the plebiscites, with the status referendums, right? When we vote, what status we want. First of all, like I said, it's non-binding, but more importantly, and this was discussed in the UN for many years and it's still being discussed, but specifically, it was the diplomat for India. He said, here's the thing, Puerto Ricans cannot truly, freely, and democratically have a status referendum while still being colonized politically, but also in their minds. They can't do that. Only a free person and a free country can make a free and democratic decision about what they want for themselves.
Right. They have to be freed both like through their ideology and physically. There's just still a lot of people that still are a little bit, or I can't comment, but there's people who are still mentally colonized. I won't say how many.
No, and you can't blame them. You know, this
absolutely.
is the project, and it's been working.
They're products of the environment that they've been raised in. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's all they've known. And it's interesting because my parents have always been pro-Commonwealth, right? And I was pro-Commonwealth because they were pro-Commonwealth, right?
Right.
But when you really start learning your own country's or your own culture's history within a country, right? Then you start learning of world history. Because when I started learning about Puerto Rican liberation, I started learning, oh shit, I have to learn about Palestinian liberation if I want to understand this. If I want to understand Lolita Lebron, I have to understand what Palestine was going through. Oh, if I want to understand what Puerto Ricans were going through here, like Pedro Albizu Campos, I have to understand what the Irish were going through at the time, because our greatest freedom fighter, Pedro Albizu Campos, right? He helped the Irish write the Free Irish Constitution. He was a co-author to that. Why? Because they met in Harvard University. Because this man could speak 8 languages and had a law degree from Harvard University. Like, these freedom fighters and these people were insanely brilliant.
Yeah.
All of them. They were professors. They were authors. They were poets. They were lawyers. They spoke obviously many languages. And the story that we've been fed is that these people are insane, that they're crazy, that they're stupid, and that they're dangerous. But they're dangerous to who?
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're dangerous, but to who?
Absolutely. And then you mentioned that that Marxist-Leninist group that attacked 80 businesses and government institutions. Could you expand on that a little bit? I know I was a little surprised, and we went off on a tangent, but could you just give us a little bit more on that history? That's interesting.
They did that over a span of about 10 years.
Okay.
And they did that across Washington, D.C., New York City, and I believe a few places in Philadelphia, but I have to double check that. They did that in 3 different places in the U.S.
What was the group called?
And, Fuerzas Armadas Liberadas, which is basically FALN. That was their acronym.
Okay.
Okay. It's basically Liberated Armed Forces, Nationalist Forces. And the FBI had been on their tail, not really. The FBI had been trying to figure out who they were. And this is the best story because, oh my God, honestly, the FBI, the FBI sucks, but also they're so incompetent. Yeah, I said it. So for 10 years, these people did it. I think it was 80 bombings or 81 bombings in different states, okay? And the FBI was theorizing that there were different cells in different places, right?
Yeah.
They must have been thozens of people on this, but they could never catch them, right? So what happened on a fateful day in New York City? What happened was that this homeless guy broke into a random apartment building. I think it was in Brooklyn, I believe. Don't quote me on that. Somewhere.
New Yorkish.
And he found all these materials to make bombs and all these pamphlets and all these schematics and stuff. He didn't know what it was, so he just stole it and started selling it on the street. The police came, arrested him, and then they found that he had crazy chemicals to make bombs.
Yeah.
And they're like, "Excuse me, sir, where did you find this?" He's like, "Oh, I broke into an apartment over there." And then they called the FBI. And then the FBI surveilled the apartment and whatever, did their interviews. And they found out it was all 6 people. 2 of them were couples. They had children even. They lived in the, normal families. They weren't out and about activists or anything. They were just normal, silent people. One of them worked for the CIA.
He worked for the CIA and he was bombing. He was part of FALN. Sorry, the acronym's hard. That's crazy. Was he using any of his CIA assets?
I don't think so.
No?
I don't think so. I think it's just that's how it was. I think he learned the government structures and stuff, but they became fugitives, and then they got caught.
Clocking into work for the CIA one day and then getting off of work and bombing a business is crazy work. In your private time, doing that is crazy work.
You know what? It was either the CIA or the IRS.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think maybe it was the IRS, actually.
Okay.
The CIA was a different thing.
That's still crazy. That's still
It's the government. It was the government, deep down in there. Yeah. And, yeah. It's funny looking at their pictures, at their photos, because it's just this married couple just standing in front of their house, and you wouldn't know, but they look so cool, You're oh, damn, they're doing all this secret stuff nobody knew.
They're just the most average people ever. They're not even political in their private life. That is
nothing.
An absolutely insane story. So moving on, what would an independent Puerto Rico look like to you? What do you hope for the future of Puerto Rico? Just self-determination, just things like that. What would you hope it would look like?
80% of the food we eat is imported from the United States. We cannot import anything from anywhere else. It has to go through U.S. ships. So things that we import, it can only be brought in by U.S. ships. So let's suppose we want something from, I don't know,
China.
From China or something, right? The Chinese vessel would come. They would have to stop in Florida somewhere, right? Or along that coast. Change all those containers, all that stuff, into a U.S. ship with a U.S. flag, navigated, employed by U.S. workers, and then they would have to bring it to the island. So that's what they do all the time. So our food and a lot of the things we have that are imported cost more. By the way, that's called the Jones Act that was enacted in the early 1900s, and the Jones Act is still applicable also in Alaska.
Mm.
Yes. So that's a problem. I would like to see a Puerto Rico that is more self-sufficient in terms of growing their food. That's what I would like to see, because we have good farmlands. At a certain point, when the U.S. got Puerto Rico in 1898, we were debt-free as an island. There was no debt that the Spanish had on us or that the U.S. acquired through Puerto Rico. We're debt-free. I would like to see, more farming. I would like, obviously, the tax haven is for U.S. people is extremely colonial law, and it benefits
just random millionaires. Yeah.
All the money doesn't go into Puerto Rico. It goes to the United States. So none of that, right? If you ask me personally, I would like to see more socialist policies, obviously. Yeah, more socialist policies. And I think with the people like Puerto Ricans, we're already doing a lot of socialism. We have to. Otherwise, we would die. But it's informal,
It's a lot of mutual aid stuff, like just community stuff to help protect yourself, because you guys are being exploited so heavily that you just have to come together as a community to survive. So you want to expand that to more like institutionalized government level.
Yes.
Yeah, things like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And obviously, engage with other countries, have a seat at the UN. The Palestinians just got a seat.
Yeah.
Is this not now the time for us to be like, excuse me, sirs, what's up? We're a colony also.
Get that seat next to all the Caribbean islands. Yeah, absolutely.
By the way, you know who's our number one advocate in the UN? Consistently for years? Cuba.
Cuba? Absolutely.
Cuba. Yeah.
I would bet on it. Yeah. How can just average Americans help out, the Puerto Rican cause, just Puerto Rico in general? Like how can an average Joe help out, just raise awareness for this cause?
I think there has to be a change in mindset, a lot of it. And I think a lot of Americans see us as charity when a hurricane passes through.
Right.
Or when there's any natural disaster. I was there for the earthquake a few years ago. It was crazy. And I think there has to be a change in mindset about that. When I went to college in 2001, okay, people thought that I lived in a mud hut. Americans in 2001. They would be like, you're from Puerto Rico? How did you get here? I'm like, okay, I took an airplane. We have airplanes.
Right.
And about half of Americans don't even know we're U.S. citizens, first of all. When Maria passed, right, and hit Puerto Rico, and I'm going to say this, the disaster wasn't Hurricane Maria, it was a U.S. imperialism. That was a disaster. When Maria hit Puerto Rico, a lot of U.S. newspapers called us refugees, which is technically incorrect because a refugee is from a foreign nation that they had to escape due to the political climate. of the foreign nation, whatever it was. We're not foreign. We're US citizens. But then again, guess what? A lot of newspapers said the same thing about Black people during Katrina. They called them refugees.
Right.
So there has to be a change in mindset around that. I'm going to be very honest. I researched this a lot after Maria, even in my own town on Long Island, New York City. All these people are like, we need to help these people. Let's send them food. Let's send them money. They need our help. Let's send them all this stuff. I'm like, where is all this like concern about Puerto Ricans when you go vote in Congress for people that hate us? When terrible colonial laws are passing, right? And you tell us, oh no, we're here. Somebody told me 2 weeks ago when I brought up Puerto Rico that was a single issue, that I should look at the bigger picture.
Single voter issue.
Single voter issue.
Mm.
And I was like, okay, so Palestine is a single issue. Puerto Rico is a single issue. So anything. Because I love telling people that when they do the fear mongering of like, you have to vote for this person because if not, women won't be able to vote. I'm like, did you know that U.S. citizens who are women in Puerto Rico can't vote? And they're like, what? I was like, yeah, nobody can vote in Puerto Rico. They're like, yeah, but that doesn't really count.
Right.
Like, I keep telling people, I was like, Puerto Ricans don't want your charity. We don't want your charity. We want justice. We want self-determination. We want dignity. Like, so many newspapers and so many people in the U.S. went to help in Puerto Rico. Thank you, whatever, right? But then they come back and these are the stories. Oh, the Puerto Ricans, they were so grateful. They were so grateful for us. They were so grateful. And it's that sort of white savior thing.
Absolutely.
That is keeping us down. Like, if you're going to do a drive for Hurricane Maria, great, do it. But then at the same time, even Puerto Ricans here in the U.S., you tell them to speak English.
Right.
Puerto Ricans here in the U.S., you're discriminatory against them. You go to Puerto Rico to vacation after a hurricane. What? During COVID, Puerto Rico opened for tourism in order to attract Americans, right? Tourism money, and Americans would come and disobey laws, COVID laws, and also Puerto Rican laws, and vacation there while Puerto Ricans were suffering from not having enough health care, medical care, etc., etc. It's insane.
And that decision was made without your consent, Puerto Rican's consent, right?
That decision was made by the tourism department, which was basically mostly outsourced to a U.S. consulting group. So yeah, it was not made by the Puerto Ricans for the Puerto Ricans. It was made by the Puerto Ricans in politics that benefit from that tourism money. Right. And Puerto Ricans don't benefit from that. We make at most 9% of our GDP in tourism, and that's like the uppermost that we've ever made. We usually make from 5 to 7.
Okay. Are there any groups like within mainland U.S. Political groups that help out Puerto Rico or fight for the Puerto Rican cause that you recommend people join or check out?
There are very many centralized groups. It depends where you're living.
Okay.
There could be a group nearby. They're usually pro-independence groups.
Okay.
So they're not charity, They're about addressing policies and laws and status.
Absolutely.
But it is, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very fragmented. So because the U.S. has always fragmented these groups. That's what they've always done. Like, colonizers are so fragile. Like, even if it's two people, they're like, we're taking them down.
Right.
That's it. No, I was like, they're because of anything. They go in there really quick. And I think one of the major reasons, so I was listening to Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? Talk about his book, talking about Palestine and paralleling that to the Jim Crow South, right? And I've heard like a lot of people in the U.S. parallel what's happening in Palestine, the genocide, with, you know, what the U.S. did to the Native Americans, right?
Yeah.
My whole point is you don't have to look far back. You can look today. Look at Puerto Rico today.
Yeah.
Look at Puerto Rico today. That's it. Look at Puerto Rico today. And you have it right there. And it's really ironic because, and also I see it here in the United States today as well. I see Puerto Rican colonialism. And this is like a really good example. I was writing my book. I always go to this coffee shop nearby, and I was grabbing sugar for my coffee, and I see the sugar, and it reminded me of the first governor who turned all of Puerto Rico into sugarcane plantations, right? Wealthy investors from the U.S. bought those lands and turned them into a sugar empire, which ended up being Domino Sugar. And that was the sugar I was looking at while writing about how this first governor just took all our land and sold them to the U.S. and created the Domino Sugar empire while I was having Domino Sugar.
The universe was trying to send you a message.
But it's everywhere, you know?
Right.
It's everywhere. I asked the coffee shop, right? I asked them, I was like, hey, you always play music and stuff. Have you ever thought about playing a few Spanish songs? Let's sprinkle them in there.
Yeah.
And they literally said to me, they said, listen, we used to, but then like people started complaining.
Oh my God.
Because this is America.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's wild.
So it's everywhere. It's everywhere.
Right. Hey, you know, it reminds me of your talk of self-sufficiency reminds me of that one Thomas Sankara quote. I might butcher it, but he said like, we don't need seeds or fertilizer. We need shovels and self-sufficiency. You know, like don't send us your aid, like food aid. Send us seeds for us to make our own food. And that seems like really what you want for Puerto Rico and what so many people want for Puerto Rico. That's
funny that you... Sorry.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
It's funny that you say that about seeds because after Hurricane Maria, disaster capitalism was rampant in Puerto Rico, and actually a lot of companies, including Starbucks, Nestle, and other big conglomerates sent coffee seeds to Puerto Rico to start up the coffee farms, to invest in Puerto Rican coffee.
Right. So even when you're being saved, it's like a private venture capitalist attempt to just expropriate as much as they can. That's this has been a very enlightening conversation, a little bit frustrating at times, you know, in terms of what America has done to Puerto Rico, but that's just par for the course. I just want to end this sort of with what are your favorite, you know, Puerto Rican cuisines? Like what are cuisines that from Puerto Rico that don't get enough love, you know, just to like sort of round this conversation out.
Okay, first of all, mofongo, which is mashed plantains with like garlic in it and several seasonings. Mofongo is very good. It's very Puerto Rican. My great grandmother used to make pasteles, which is also this all plantains. It's like kind of like a plantain pie that you shove meat inside it. It's very delicious, and we usually have it during Christmas time. If you go to Puerto Rico, people always think rum and think Bacardi. That's not Puerto Rican rum.
Okay.
Donku is Puerto Rican rum. So that's a good rum.
Okay.
And there's been some debate about this, but pina coladas, supposedly, we still don't know the specific history, but it was made very famous by the Hilton Hotel, the first Hilton Hotel in Puerto Rico, to bring in U.S. tourism. It was called like the Miami of the Caribbean or something, and it was for tourists, so it wasn't for Puerto Ricans. So that's so when you go to Puerto Rico and drink pina coladas, That's for tourists.
Okay. So the pina colada is a colonialist drink. It's not.
Even though it might have been invented by a Puerto Rican, like it was made famous by the Hilton Hotel.
Okay. So we don't claim the pina colada.
No, so like those are misconceptions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, this has been an absolutely enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for being on. I feel like I learned a lot about Puerto Rico. What are some sources that you recommend people start out, and where can people best find your book and your work?
Well, it's not published yet.
Okay.
I'm working on publishing it. What if you want to start with just the plain truth about U.S. colonialism in Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican history, which is very digestible and actually super fun to read and very easy to read, that you're gonna be like, what? There's a book called War Against All Puerto Ricans, and actually Bad Bunny was just seen reading it, just so you know.
Okay.
Yes, War. I think that's a perfect introductory book to Puerto Rico. If you want to go more in depth about the modern history of Puerto Rico since like the 2000s on, specifically the economic turmoil in Puerto Rico, there's a book called Fantasy Island, which is very good. And it's also an easy read. It's not like super economic, you know? That's an amazing book. Ooh. Another book about if you want to know general Puerto Rican history, starting from the Spanish colonizers all the way to basically Bad Bunny. Literally, the guy ends with Bad Bunny. It's the book that that American guy critiqued. It's called Puerto Rico and National History.
Okay.
And it's very easy to read. It's actually the easiest book to read. That's like a good overall intro. But if you really, I would say start with War Against All Puerto Ricans.
Okay. So that's a really good introductory text. Okay.
Yeah.
And
it's an amazing book.
And where can people best follow you on social media, and to like sort of follow your and also follow your like the publishing of your book, get updates on that?
My main source of social media is TikTok, so you can follow me through there. I always try to put like glimpses of history that expose U.S. colonialism in Puerto Rico, including history from 1901, but including history from 2 weeks ago. You know?
Yeah.
Because you can say, like, I even tell my friends sometimes, I'm like, hey, tell me a word. And they'll say something like, I don't know, like banana. And I was like, the plantations, the plantains. I can totally look up the history of this, and there's going to be colonialism drenched on everything about this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I also, I believe that once you start with those books, then you'll start learning, you'll want to learn about history from around the world, because it's impossible not to. Because like I said, in order to learn Puerto Rican history, you need to learn U.S. history, but also you need to learn Cuban history, and you need to learn even Venezuelan history. You need to learn Palestinian history, Irish history, all of it. It's all Algerian history. Like, it's all connected.
Right.
And it's very exciting, honestly.
Right. Yeah. Nothing exists in a vacuum. Everything is interconnected. Everything in history moves through internal contradictions and external forces. And nothing is permanent.
Yeah, and you will see that like there's no such thing as, just national. Oh, I only care about national concerns. National concerns are international concerns.
Absolutely. Especially in the modern day world, where everything is internationally related. Maybe you could make that argument in like the 1400s or something. Even then, like when Columbus landed in Puerto Rico, and he landed in Cuba. But when they started colonizing these areas, it was connected to the international trade of Europe, and that was connected to the trade of Asia, and it's inescapable, pretty much.
Yeah, the Portuguese were also doing their thing at the time. But when I was like sort of debating the title for my book, which I didn't use this, but I thought it was an interesting quote. It was a quote from Malcolm X, and the quote was, "Mississippi is America." And his point was like, America is not the places that have the most money or that look aesthetically pleasing the entire time. America is the places that are in most need and most struggle. That's what defines a country.
Yeah.
The place in it that's the most need. And I was like, Puerto Rico is America.
Oh, okay. I was going to say Mississippi is America is a terrible title for a book about Puerto Rico.
No, but I was thinking like Puerto Rico is America.
Okay.
It's a place in which the citizens can't even vote. We don't have the same equal rights. We are not protected under the Constitution.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah, just pretty much full stop. What's the title of the book that you finally ended up picking? Or is it still a work in progress?
No, I picked it. So remember I was speaking to you about how history is written by the winners?
Yeah.
But it's really history is written by the people who are alive. And then they killed all the other people who could have written a counter history. I decided to name this book Puerto Rican Loser. Because that's the history I'm writing from the loser's perspective, but I'm still alive. So I'm going to say it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Christina. This has been an absolutely enlightening conversation. I'm looking forward to getting your book when it comes out. And everybody, please go follow Christina. She makes absolutely wonderful videos on Puerto Rican history. And it is just a very, very well-educated person overall. Do you have any like final words, closing words that you want to just get out there?
I just want to say that like, just speak about it. Just start speaking about it because Puerto Rico is invisible and it has been made invisible by design. Even if you don't care about Puerto Rico, even if it's not connected to you in any way, it is. It is connected to you. Because the way the United States have treated Puerto Ricans, they will treat you eventually.
Absolutely.
And that was made very obvious to me even by the passing of Hurricane Helene, that people were saying, oh my God, look at what they're doing to these people. I'm like, yeah, they did that to Puerto Ricans during Hurricane Maria in 2017. And they did that to Puerto Ricans at 1899 during Hurricane Siriaco. Like, it'll happen. And also remember that in Puerto Rico, like, it's not a bipartisan politics thing. Like, both parties, any U.S. president has been a colonizer because we have been a colony this entire time.
Mm-hmm. So you can't vote out exploitation of Puerto Rico as America's currently set up. Yeah.
We're so invisible that even Vice President Harris, who's running right now, she doesn't even mention us once in her platform.
Yeah. Wasn't it that she was in Puerto Rico and people were yelling out in Spanish, "Colonizer go"? What were they yelling out again? That was a very funny moment. Colonizer go.
Yes, they were singing a type of song that is called a plena in Puerto Rico, and it was actually invented by a lot of Afro-Puerto Ricans actually to critique governments. And when she came over to visit, I believe it was in March, she came over and they started singing a song to her saying, "Colonizer, what are you doing here? Are you coming here to impose another board to decide our economic futures for us? Or what are you doing here, colonizer?" And she didn't know what they were saying.
And she was clapping along.
That decides our future doesn't even speak our language.
Yeah.
So she was clapping along and she didn't know. When they told her, she stopped clapping. But let me tell you what's more important than that, because that's a funny moment. It just shows, it's a fun tidbit social media thing. But what's more important than that is that she came to Puerto Rico just for that day. She went to this community center, which was where they sang that to her, right? There were protests against her when she landed, and the protests included criticizing her, solidarity with Palestine, and solidarity with Haiti, okay? And then what she did some talking about what the United States, how the United States have helped Puerto Ricans because of the hurricane. By the way, Puerto Ricans, since 7 years ago, since Maria, FEMA still hasn't helped hundreds of Puerto Ricans rebuild their homes.
Oh my
7
God.
years ago. They still haven't sent them the aid to rebuild their homes since 7 years ago. But that's besides the point. She spent half an hour doing a press thing, and then she spent a few hours raising funds for, back then it was Biden-Harris, right? For the election, the upcoming election. And guess who hosted that? Richard Prouty, which is an American wealthy businessman that came to Puerto Rico for the tax haven. Prouty hosted that in his complex, which is called Citadela. That complex was where the previous Secretary of Education in Puerto Rico, which was an American woman that was appointed as the Secretary of Education in Puerto Rico, that's where she stayed for $1 a month in exchange for her giving Nicholas Prouty public school land so he could expand his complex. That's illegal. She got caught by the FBI and she actually went to prison. But Prouty's fine.
She's just giving the speech, the opening speech. There. Well, who was it? It was Prouty that was arrested, and they were giving the opening speech.
No, the Secretary of Education was arrested.
Okay,
he was fine,
okay.
But he was hosting Kamala, for fundraising.
That is insane. They
fundraised hundreds of thousands, and that's who she was partying with when she came to Puerto Rico, with a tax evader that has displaced us, who did deals with that Secretary of Education. Her name is Julia Kelleher, who was responsible for the closing of over 600 schools.
And that, oh my God. You know, I've always said that, like, in the colonial context, like, the face of the empire sort of stretched, you know, like, you really see the true face of liberal society. And I think Puerto Rico, like, obviously Palestine is such an obvious example of that. You know, there's this liberal mythos of, like, all man is created equal. Well, obviously not. And, you know, it's the face comes off and the fascism comes forward. But Puerto Rico, this is just such an obvious example of how the mythos of liberalism is extended within the colonial context and the mask comes off. It reminds me of that Césaire quote where fascism is just colonialism turned inward. And what we're really seeing in America in recent years isn't that anything special to the American empire. It's just what they've been doing to Puerto Rico, what they've been doing to Vietnam and Algeria and, you know, Palestine. It's just turned inward on our own population for the first time in a long time. But, you know, in even like I was like trying to talk to you about like, oh, you know, America, you know, what do you hope in America? And you were just like straight up, it doesn't matter, you know, if America is declining or if it's doing well. In Puerto Rico, it's shit for us. You know, we're always on the end of the stick. You know, we're always getting the bad end of the deal no matter what's going on. It's just insane. It's just insane. I wasn't even aware of half of these things, you know, not even Puerto Rican history, not even like these. And it should be absolutely in our history books. And I have not seen a single mainstream American history book or even obscure history book written by people who are more favorable to these things that mention this Puerto Rican history, this events by Puerto Rican activists that should be on the front page, and just how Puerto Ricans are treated. This is just, you know, I've always known that things are bad in Puerto Rico, but just good God, this is just a disgusting. All I can say is just death to America. You know, long live Puerto Rico.
That's the thing. I was like, if you can do me one favor, is whenever anybody talks to you about Puerto Rico and they call it a territory or like a commonwealth or something, correct them. It's a colony.
Yeah.
It's a colony. That's it. Let's start with that.
Yeah.
That's it.
Is there any other language that you think we should be careful about when we're talking about Puerto Rico?
In terms of, like, I always correct people. I always say it's a colony. Let's not sugarcoat it, because that's propaganda telling us we're a territory, we're a commonwealth. That's all propaganda. It's just language, you know? One thing is, I would say phrases that I would debunk immediately, and I debunk all the time is, well, how can Puerto Rico survive without the United States? You ask, actually, how can Puerto Rico survive with the United States?
Yeah. Or how can the United States survive without Puerto Rico? I mean, it needs its colonies, things like that. Yeah.
And when people say, well, Puerto Ricans vote in the plebiscite, so they decide what they want. That's not true. That's all theater.
Yeah.
That's all theater. That's all it is. That's not true. You cannot, like I said, you cannot have a free and democratic election in a context of colonialism.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. I know I already gave you a chance for closing words, but any other closing words? You know, this sort of went on another tangent, but closing words. Any last closing words?
And I actually want to talk to Puerto Ricans now.
Okay.
And I know there's like a lot of division, right? Because we all believe different things. But I do want to come out in support of Puerto Rican diaspora because people forget about them a lot. And actually, they've been some of our most ardent and passionate fighters for our dignity and our liberation. They're no less Puerto Ricans than Puerto Ricans on the island. And it doesn't matter if you speak Spanish perfectly or if you speak Spanish at all. That doesn't matter. So that whole idea of like who's more Puerto Rican, who's less Puerto Rican, we're all living a legacy of U.S. colonialism. Some of us were displaced and some of us weren't. And that's the only difference. None of us had a choice. None of us had a choice. So we're all like inheriting that history and playing it out in our lives. But in the diaspora, they're just as Puerto Rican as people in the island.
Absolutely. Where is the Puerto Rican diaspora mostly? It's New York, right? And
New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and some in Florida.
Some in Florida. Okay.
Pennsylvania is big with Puerto Ricans.
I was not aware of the Pennsylvania one. I've always heard Puerto Ricans in New York. Florida, but Pennsylvania, that's so random.
Yeah, what people call them New Yorkers because, you know, they try things, but they're Puerto Ricans as well, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I can't comment on this. I'm an outsider, so I'll just. But
it's a whole thing. But that's, you know, that's also like a wedge to divide us. You know, you displace people to different places and tell them different things, and you destroy their culture and their bonds. And no, we're not going to do that.
Absolutely. And I know so many Puerto Ricans who are just proud of being Puerto Rican. I mean, in America, you know, even if they're like second generation, third generation, they don't speak Spanish that well, or maybe not at all, but they're still proud. They're still they're still representing their culture. I mean, yeah.
Puerto Rican culture is many things, you know. We're not a stereotype. We're many things. Absolutely. All across the board. Yeah. So it's very interesting. Yeah.
Well, Christina, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for being here. And you have a good one. Also thank you for being so understanding. Because in case people don't know, we were supposed to have this talk a couple days ago, but I had technical difficulties and everything. So
yes, technical issues.
Thank you for being so understanding.
No problem.
Okay, you have a good one.
You too. Thank you.
This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you. What the fuck? Glory to Stalin, I barely made it. And a special shout out to Mateus T, who is currently a member of our Marshal of the Soviet Union tier. If you'd like a shout out and to access episodes up to a month early, please consider subscribing to our Patreon. Thank you.